Hey guys, it's Tab from Freefly. I want to talk you through setup on a Cinestar 3-axis gimbal with 3-axis Radian. We're going to do an in-depth video showing you exactly how to set it up, wire it, program it, everything for S-Bus, PPM, and a Spectrum satellite. Right now I've got an S-Bus receiver because that's what we use. And I'll be using this for the demonstration. An important point is the setup is exactly identical if you use S-Bus, PPM receiver, or a Spectrum satellite. So even though for this demonstration we'll have the S-Bus receiver on there, the important point is just that it's identical whether you use S-Bus, PPM, or Spectrum. I'll show how to connect the Spectrum and PPM. When I say Spectrum, I mean Spectrum satellite. The Spectrum satellite as well as a PPM receiver at the end of the video, just so you can see exactly how it's connected. So let's just go through the wiring real quick. So you can see right here I've got my S-Bus receiver. From there, I've got a 5-volt input right here. It's just a power supply we use for these videos with a switch. One nice thing to do when you wire up the gimbal is put a switch on your power supply. It makes it really nice if you're tuning things to be able to shut the gimbal off if it spins around or does something unexpected. You just kill the switch and off it goes. So from the S-Bus receiver on the S-Bus output, I've got a little short male-to-male servo lead, which goes under the boom here, and then this feeds into the pan Radian in slot 1, which is the input. So what's happening here is from the S-Bus connection is a serial connection from this Futaba receiver, and it's sending the information for all the channels on the Futaba receiver to the Radian. The pan Radian is then feeding all of this data forward to the roll Radian, and then from the roll Radian to the tilt Radian. So if you use S-Bus, PPM, or a Spectrum satellite, those are all serial connections, and they contain multiple channel data on one connection. So it makes wiring the system very nice if you choose one of those 3 systems. We also support PWM, but the wiring is a little messier, and if you're buying a new radio specifically for Cinestar 3-axis gimbal with a Radian setup, I really recommend you go with one of those methods just because the wiring is so nice. So to continue on down the chain, from the pan Radian, we've got the port configuration is in the manual, but basically port 1 is the input, port 2 is another input if you're using PWM, or if you're using S-Bus, Spectrum satellite, or PPM, it can be an auxiliary output. So you can drive accessories using port 2, such as camera shutter, some of the MK zoom controllers, just various, anything you could drive an extra servo from that if you wanted to, if you have a little custom switch you fabricated or something like that. Anything, it'll just gives you the option to have basically the same thing as a connection from your receiver, but from any of the points that these Radians are installed, which gives you really nice flexibility as far as routing. Like if you have a camera shutter that you want to run just right here, you can just run it from the auxiliary output of the tilt. Nice short little wire over to the camera, just ease of installation really. So then port 3 is the port we use to output from the pan Radian to the roll. So port 3 from the pan goes into port 1 on the roll. So this is sending that some signal from the pan to the roll, and then just the same way we have port 3 on the roll headed out to port 1 on the tilt. So it's just daisy chaining. You can think of it almost like water flowing from pan to roll to tilt, from coming into 1, out through 3, into 1, out through 3, into 1. Port 4 on the Radian is always the servo output. So that's where port 4 on the pan is your pan servo, port 4 on the roll is your roll servo, port 4 on the tilt is your tilt servo. And if you're getting confused on any of this, what I recommend you do is just to start with, just write the default configurations for pan, tilt, and roll, and then all you really need to do is plug in the servo on port 4, and then provide power to the system, and that'll be provided through the input-output that we just talked about. That'll at least get your system up and stabilizing, and you can start to tune it, and then as you get more familiar with the system, you can jump in and then add, you can assign the mode switch that we'll talk about in a second. But certainly just getting power and setting those default configurations will get the system up and stabilizing, and you can start from there. All right, so let's talk about the actual Radian stabilizer program. So when you're using Spectrum, Satellite, S-Bus, or PPM, and it's sending these sum signals through the system, you're going to have to assign in the configuration window. You're going to have to assign a few things, because basically each Radian has access to all the channels that are being output from your receiver. So what we need to do is we need to go in and tell each Radian which one to listen to, essentially. So right now, the way Hue operates with this, we've got it set up so all of the Radians, the mode setting is set to switch 5. So that is mapped to switch C, and you can see when he goes all the way up on the transmitter, it kills the gimbal. It's set to off mode. If he goes to the center position, this is stabilized mode, but no slewing. So the mount is stabilizing when we're in this middle mode, but he doesn't have any slew control. You can see when I'm doing this, nothing's happening. Another important point is when you're just in the stabilized mode, the pan axis, the PWM drive, is dead to that. So the only mode right now which activates the pan axis is stabilized slew. That's an important fact, because if you activate this, we get a lot of people have been confused on this. They say, I'm setting it up and I've got it on the bench like this, and I turn it to stabilized slew and the multirotor spins around. You can see that happening here. So it's starting to spin. I can correct it, but as you can see, it runs away. I can't do anything about it. I can try and drive it back the other way. The point is, this whole system needs to be bolted to your multirotor and suspended off the table in order to tune the pan axis. Because if you think about it, what the pan axis is trying to do is it's trying to stabilize. So if it's on the ground here, it can't stabilize. The Radian is sending commands for this servo to move to stabilize, and it's not moving. So the Radian is sending more command because it's not sensing a movement and it's not moving. So it's sending more and more and more and more and more, and you're essentially getting this runaway effect on the pan axis, like you can see here. So just super important, make sure you hang the system from a rope or suspend the 2 booms or something like that, just so the 3-axis gimbal is off the bench. And you can see in the diagnostics window, you can see when we cycle that mode switch, you can see this is off, this is stabilized, and this is stabilized slew. So those are represented by the red, the brown, and the green. And you can see that we've set this system, the mode is 5, the slew, sorry, I hadn't read it. The mode is 5, the slew is 1, which on the Futaba corresponds to the aileron. So you can see as I move the aileron stick there, the slew is going back and forth. So when Hugh's running the gimbal, this is what he's controlling with pan. You can see all the other settings that we've talked about previously. Those are pretty self-explanatory. I just want to get through the meat and potatoes of setting this up and getting the thing functioning. The other things to pay attention to in the diagnostic window, you can see that the slew bar, that doesn't go green until I'm in stabilized slew. And you can see that moving as I'm going back and forth in the stick. When that's not green, that's telling you that you do not have slew. So you can see it moving back and forth, but what it's saying is it's not taking that slew input and doing anything with it. The servo out, you can see basically what it's doing, what signal it's sending to the servo out. So you can see right there, the system is trying to send a command to the servo, but it's not getting a movement, so it's sending more and more and more and more. And that's because this thing is not suspended above the table like we need it to be for tuning pan. All right, so the next item I want to talk about real quickly is the defaults. So the defaults for the Cinestar gimbal are pan 1, tilt 1, and roll 1. The inclusion of pan 2, tilt 2, and roll 2, those are just some auxiliary mounting orientations for people that are going to use this on other gimbals. But if you're a Cinestar customer and you've got it set up as we've described in this video and in the manual, you always want to use pan 1, tilt 1, and roll 1. The next thing I want to talk about briefly, just to help with understanding how the system works, is the input monitor. You click here below the input channels. When you're using S-Bus, a Spectrum satellite, or a PPM receiver, it's like we talked about earlier, it's sending all the channel information over one connection. So if you go in this input channel monitor, this will really help you decipher what's going on. So you can just open this up and play with the different sticks, and you can see what's what. So for instance, when I move the aileron stick on the Futaba back and forth, you can see channel 1 going back and forth. Move the elevator, channel 2 is going back and forth. The throttle, number 3 is going back and forth, very little. That's how I've got it set up for this gimbal. Number 4, I've actually got for number 4 disabled. For the roll axis, I've got it disabled in the software, but I also have it disabled on the transmitter from a previous setup on this transmitter. Number 5, you can see this is our mode setting. You can see there's off, there's stabilized, and there's stabilized slew. So channel 8, you can see we've got set up as a remote shutter. So that's one thing to talk about. So you can see I've got aux set to 8, and I've got that set up to be a remote shutter for the camera. So you can see when I activate this spring-loaded switch on the 8FG, channel 8 is going between negative 131% and 31%. These were, for the particular remote shutter that we're using, these are the ATVs that it takes to get it to fire. So you can see how the aux setup works on that. A few things I want to talk about on the gimbal that might not be perfectly clear from the manual and the videos that we released previously. All axes now are no longer using a potentiometer. So you can remove the potentiometer from the roll axis. I'm assuming you've done this if you've successfully mounted the roll Radian. You can't remove the pot from the tilt axis because it's needed for structural reasons still. And when you do remove this, it's important that you install the included resistors into the servos. If you try and stabilize the gimbal with the Radian without the resistors installed, the axes will just run wide open no matter what the Radian tries to do, and eventually the Radian has a fail-safe feature where if the axis is not responding in the way that it anticipates, it'll actually shut down the drive to the servo. So it'll give it 3 attempts and then it will shut down the drive. Let's talk about, I know we talked about this setup and how it pertains to the PPM and the Spectrum satellite receiver setup, but I'm actually going to go through and show how those would be wired so you can see explicitly how to do so. So right now I've got this lead coming from the pan to the S-Bus receiver. In the Spectrum example, we wouldn't have that. What we would have is, here's a Spectrum receiver, satellite receiver. I keep calling it a receiver, it's a satellite receiver. So we would have this installed directly into the pan Spectrum satellite receiver port. So you can see this would now be powered from the Radian pan module. Let me turn on this Spectrum. So you can see I'm running it from the Spectrum now. You can see we've got control of it. I've got it set up, so this is a DX5E I just have for testing here. It's only got a 2-position switch. This is another important point. If you've got a transmitter that's only got a 2-position switch, you can still set it up so that you have an off mode and then a stabilized slew mode. So right now we've got off, and if I go forward on the switch, now we've got stabilized slew. I've got control of tilt, I've got control of pan, even though it's not responding properly because it's sitting on the bench. But click that, back to off. So you can see with the Spectrum setup, all we need to do is we run the Spectrum satellite directly into the pan Radian, and then the same exact wiring as we had on the S-Bus, this will feed all of the Spectrum channels forward from pan to roll to tilt. All right, so let me give you the example for the PPM. So a lot of people are using PPM, so this is an important one. I've got a Gropner, what is this guy? MX20. So the only difference on this would be that rather than running it into this Futaba S-Bus receiver, we'd run it into the PPM output of the GR16 receiver, which I have here. This receiver, it has to come out of the 8th channel. So let me get that guy plugged into channel 8. Now let's apply power to this GR16. So we've got power going to the GR16. Turn the transmitter on. Okay, so you can see in much the same way as the S-Bus, we've got, let me reconnect. So you can see I've got the mode set up on switch 4. I'm sorry, switch 5. So you can see I've got control of that with the Grapner in exactly the same way as the Futaba. I've got control of tilt when I go into stabilized slew, and I've got control of the pan. Even though there's options in the Radian stabilizer program, you can make changes in the radio. For instance, if you want to slow down your slew rate, you can either change it in the software or you can change it on the transmitter. You can just dial back the ATVs for the given channel that you have controlling slew, and that'll work in exactly the same way as slowing down the rate in the Radian software. You can also put exponential in your transmitter if you want to soften the feel of the pan tilt or roll axis around center. All right, one other feature I wanted to talk about that we use a lot and find very helpful is on an 8FG, I've got Hue set up with 3 different flight modes, and I have the flight mode set up on switch E. So we've got flight mode 1, flight mode 2, flight mode 3, and we've got these set up for 3 different type of filming operations. Flight mode 1 is the fastest. It's got the pan and tilt rates set fairly fast. We use this on car commercials, things where action's happening very quickly, and Hue needs the ability to pan and tilt very quickly to keep up with the action. But that setup's not good if we're doing scenic stuff. So if you're doing scenic things and you want to have very subtle and finessed moves, you need to slow it down. It can be annoying to have to change this. So Hue's got the ability to decide which mode is the best for his needs in flight with this switch. So we've got fast, medium, and ultra slow. And you can see on the best way to illustrate this is on the slew window here on the Freefly Radian stabilizer. So this is our slow mode. You can see that when I go full deflection on the stick, it's going negative 10% to 10%. So this gives very, very slow moves. It allows Hue to do very fluid and beautiful moves with the camera gimbal. If we go into the middle mode, you can see if I go full stick, it's negative 26 and 26. So that's 2.5 times as fast as the slow mode. And then if we go into the fastest mode, you can see it's all the way up to negative 50 and positive 53. The way that we're doing this is we've mapped to these 3 flight modes in the 8FG in much the same way you would with a helicopter. You can change the ATV for the slew channel for these 3 flight modes. I just wanted to, this is a little bit more complex than a basic setup, but I think it's very helpful for giving the camera operator the ability to choose his mode based on the kind of filming you're doing. I know if it's too touchy and you're trying to film nice scenics, it can be very difficult. So I just think this is a good way to set it up to provide your camera operator with some options to adjust on the fly based on the needs that he has that day. Hey guys, the one setup we didn't talk about yet is using a PWM receiver. So right here I've got a Spectrum AR6210, which came with, I think it came with this guy. I'm not using the Spectrum satellite here, I'm just using the Spectrum receiver, so it's sending just regular PWM inputs. I wanted to show how to set those up so that you have the same functionality you would if you were using the Spectrum satellite, S-Bus, or PPM. So as you can see, I've got now, rather than just 1 lead going from the receiver to the pan Radian, I've got 2. So I've got 1 lead going from the aileron channel on this receiver to the pan Radian. So that gives me aileron control. You can see the slew channel going back and forth as I move the aileron stick. So you can see, just like with the other setups, we've got control there. And then the mode switch, the mode signal is being sent from my gear channel on this to the pan. So, and this is the gear channel. So as you can see, that's operating the mode switch back and forth, and it's going from the off mode, which is nothing happening because there's only a 2-position switch, remember. It's going off mode to stabilize slew. So I've now got control of the slew. If we had a 3-position switch available on this transmitter, I would set it up just exactly the same way that the Futaba was set up, with off, stabilize, and stabilize slew. So that would give us 3 settings. But I just want people to understand that the when you don't have access to PPM, S-Bus, or Spectrum satellite, you can set it up like this with PWM. It takes 2 leads per Radian if you want to have control of the slew and the mode. You don't necessarily have to have control of the mode on any other channel other than pan, and that's just to disable the pan axis for takeoff and landing. You can certainly just have the slew channel go from roll to tilt, and all that means is that you'll always be in stabilized slew mode, which isn't really a big deal because unlike the pan axis, if this is always stabilizing and you always have slew control, it's not such a huge deal. You can work around that. I do think the PPM, the S-Bus, and the Spectrum is much easier setup, and I think I would recommend that one if you have any of those options. If you do have a Spectrum receiver, there's no reason not to just plug in the satellite to the pan axis and then have all the added benefits like we just showed on that setup. So I think that highlights the PWM setup nicely.